Greetings, and welcome to episode 2 of Hot Cocoa. Now, I know I kind of promised that we would be doing some programming today. I lied. Just a little bit, though. Instead, we are going to begin by taking a look at the history of Cocoa and Objective-C, learning where it came from, and also taking a look at the history of Apple. That's right, Apple. And then, afterwards, we're going to take a look at just how Objective-C and Cocoa work, and how they are different from C itself. You know, what classes are, what methods are, what instance methods are, and class methods, and all that fun stuff. But first, a movie.
The year is 1976, and Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and another guy named Ronald, who isn't important, create a company called Apple in their garage to sell the Apple I, a computer kit hand-built by Wozniak. It includes a CPU, RAM, and a basic video card, and sells for $666.66. Fast forward to 1984, and after the utter failure of the Lisa, Apple releases the first Mac to rave reviews and drunk football fans frightened by the possibility of dystopian future that they don't understand. However, troubles were brewing, and in 1985, infighting caused CEO John Sculley to remove Jobs from any of his responsibility in the company. Rather miffed at this prospect, on Friday the 13th in September 1985, Jobs resigned from Apple and started Next Computer. The engineers at Next subsequently developed a complete system, including a computer, a printer, an operating system, and a factory to put it all together in. Although popular with enthusiasts, the Next Computer never gained wide acceptance, and Next Computer became Next Software, where they developed the more successful Next Step operating system. Meanwhile, Apple was busy experiencing even more epic fail with such products as the Apple Newton, and in 1996 decided they were better off purchasing someone else's work than continuing to use their own. On December 20th, 1996, Apple bought Next and Jobs and used Next Step and its Unix base to build OS X. The information in the preceding history segment was gained from Wikipedia and is not guaranteed to be accurate in any way. Last Edit Studios and its subsidiary Hot Cocoa is not responsible for any failed grades based on the use of this information in the writing of a school report.
So what is Cocoa? Well, Cocoa is a framework that most GUI-based applications for OS X are written with. And most applications that are written with Cocoa are written in Objective-C. Now, as the name would suggest, Objective-C is an entirely object-based language, meaning everything in the language is an object, and all the objects that come with Cocoa are prefixed with NS, which stands for Next Step, which, as you saw in the intro, is the operating system from Next, which OS X is based on. So you have NS object, NS string, NS array, NS number, any number of objects that come with it, and you can also create your own objects. Now, in order to use an object, you need to create an instance of that object, and objects are defined by classes. You can think of a class as sort of a blueprint for creating an object, and from a single class you can create more than one instance of that object. So for example, from this class we can create an object called nObject, and then we have an object called myObject. Now, in order to create a new instance, you need to call a method that returns an object. In this case, we have we're creating a string using the string class method. Now, how this works is you have NSString, which is the object type. You have myString, which is the object name, and then you have the string method, and that method returns an object that then goes into the instance called myString, which is whatever you name it. Now, there's also times when string creates an auto-released, meaning from memory, an auto-release from memory object that is already initialized. But there are times when you use a function that doesn't initialize it for you, in which case your declaration will look like this. So we have an NS mutable array called myArray, and then we're using the alloc and the init functions of NS mutable array to first assign the memory for that, and then to initialize the object. And as you can see, they're nested within each other. So we have alloc, which allocates the memory, and init, which initializes the object. Now, pretty much every object that is prefixed with NS, because you can create your own too, but every object that's prefixed with NS starts out as an NS object, and then there are subclasses of NS object. For example, NS string is a subclass of NS object, and NS array is a subclass of NS object. And how subclasses work are, NS string has all the properties of NS object plus some additional properties and methods of its own. Likewise, NS array has all the properties and methods of NS object plus some of its own. And you can subclass subclasses, so NS mutable array is a subclass of NS array, and NS mutable string is a subclass of NS string. And NS mutable string has all of the properties and methods of NS string and all the properties and methods of NS object plus some of its own. Likewise, NS mutable array has all of the properties and methods of NS array and all of the properties and methods of NS object. And you can also create your own subclasses of these, which we will go into more depth in a later episode. Now, Objective-C functions differ from, or Objective-C methods rather, differ from C functions in the way they're written slightly. Take a look at this. So here's a C function, which we're calling scheduled timer with time interval function of NS timer, which is it's a long name for a C function, but I got it from the Objective-C, which is normal. And then you have all of the arguments at the end. Well, this is the Objective-C version of that. And as you can see, we still have NS timer and we still have scheduled timer with time interval. However, the arguments for it actually have names. And so we have the target argument, the selector argument, the user info argument, and the repeats argument. Now, there's a downside to this, which it takes up more space, but the upside is you don't need to look in the documentation to be able to tell what those arguments are. It tells you right there. And for whatever reason, the first argument in any method is always the method name. It doesn't have a separate argument name. And how the method works is you have the class and instance, which is first, and then the method name, and then all the arguments. Now there are two kinds of method calls. There are class methods and there are instant methods. Class methods are called by sending a message to the class itself, and usually will return an object of that class, but not always. In this case it does. We're calling the string with string class method of NS string, which would return a NS string object. And we have instance methods, which are called by sending a message to the instance of an object, like an individual object itself, not the class that defines it, which in this case we're sending the string is equal to string method to the string a string, which we'll see if a string is equal to the string I like pie. Now, you can tell the difference between a class method and an instance method by looking in the documentation at its header. Now, we'll see the definition for NS string. String with string begins with a plus sign. All class methods begin with plus signs. And then you can also see that we have id, which tells us that it returns an object. Objects are defined as id. I'm not sure why. It reminds me of Freud. And then it's the argument is an NS string. It wants an NS string for an argument. And then with the instant method, all instance methods are prefixed by a dash or a minus if you want to have the opposite of plus. And you can also tell that it will return us a Boolean value and that it also wants a NS string as an argument. Now, being an entirely objective-based language, but one that's based on C, you have regular C variables, and then you also have the object versions of them. So for example, for int and float, you have the object NS number. It can contain any sort of number you want. For char, for character, you have the NS string object, and for an array, you have the NS array object. Now, unlike normal variables, if you want to return the value of what's in the object and not get the object itself, you want to return what's in it, you'll need to call a method to the object. And here's how you do that. Now, say where you want to get the value of a string, and that string is called a string. If we want to return it as a string, we would call the method string value. Or if we want to return it as an integer, say it has a number in it, but it's a string, it's not an integer, and we want it to be an integer, we can return it as an integer. And to set it, or to set the value, it's the same as getting it, except for you prefix the method with set. So you have set string value and set int value. Now there's an important difference here between if you want to compare whether the contents of two objects are equal to each other, which is usually what you'll want to do. Now in C++, you'd just do this. You'd define two strings, and then you'd say if a string double equals is equal to b string, and then whatever you want to do, yes, they're equals. However, in Objective-C, this is what that looks like. Now, you declare two strings just like normal, but if you tried to do it the way you did it in C++ with the double equals, you would not be comparing the contents of the object. You would be comparing the two objects themselves, and they would only return true if they were the same object. So if you want to compare the contents of the ins string, you'd have to use the method is equal to string. So we have a string is equal to b string, which would return true if the contents are actually equal. And that is all for this episode of Hot Cocoa. Coming up in the next episode, we will work on our first project and learn how to link some buttons. Get all the buttons linked together and all of our components on our form linked together, and learn how to run some code from the interface. Coming up next week in Hot Cocoa, episode 3.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag.